Hey friends, today's episode is a conversation that I had with Professor Wang Gungwu at his recent book launch. It contains a fireside chat I had with him and a moderated audience Q&A. I hope you will enjoy today's conversation as much as I did.
I've been asked to respond to all that have been said, but having written 300 pages already about my rather long life, I shall only tell two stories. My first is that the book launched today is not volume 3 of my memoirs. Margaret had inspired me to write Home is Not Here for Our Children. Tommy may remember this. When he launched a book, he pointed out that I was then 88 years old, and the book only covered the first 19 years of my life. He did his sums, and that meant that I had another 4 volumes to write. And everybody laughed. My alumni friends then asked, if home is not here, where was it? You had not arrived in Singapore, and none of us appear in the book. And how can you write about home when you had not even met Margaret? So it was again Margaret who helped me answer the questions. After we married, we had moved house 6 times. Twice from Cambridge to London, twice in Singapore, and twice in Kuala Lumpur. Our 7th move was into the new house that she had helped to design and build in Petaling Jaya. 3 years later, in 1968, when we were leaving that house to go to Canberra, and I looked dejected, Margaret said, "Home is where we are." And she was right. Those words became the title of our book and completed our story of home. My other story is about the title of my new book, No Borders. I was asked, what do you mean? There are borders everywhere, notably those created when departing empires produced new nations. The whole world has borders drawn largely by Western European powers. But here is a paradox. That world order was dominated by a civilization that claimed to represent universal values. That world has no borders. In any case, my journeys have nothing to do with being civilized or with trying to be cosmopolitan. My story is actually very simple. I discovered that all borders were drawn for a purpose, and sometimes these borders are radically changed. But there are no borders between civilizations. And for me, as a student of history, time also has no borders. Nothing remains unchanged between past and present. I was 10 years old when I first noticed borders in an atlas that I was given. There were places marked in red within the borders of the British Empire. My town, Ipoh, was in the middle of one of those red patches in the atlas. Years later, when I returned to Ipoh from Nanjing, I found the empire had gone, and the Federation of Malaya was about to be a nation state. 9 Malay sultanates and 2 former colonies would now share a border. But there was an anomaly. The country's university, the University of Malaya, was outside the country in the colony of Singapore. And when Malaya became Malaysia, to include Singapore, Sarawak, and Sabah, I worked hard to promote the new nation, but only saw its borders change yet again when Singapore separated. At the same time, I had become a historian of China and learned that throughout its recorded history, every dynasty had different borders. And for a while, even the United Nations could not agree where China's borders were. I concluded that changing and crossing borders was normal. My own experience with universities confirmed that. I was a Chinese who only lived and studied in China when I was 17 and 18 years old. I then became a federal citizen of Malaya and later an Australian citizen so that I could continue my studies and have a scholarly career. I was lucky. Each of the universities I worked in gave me freedom to learn and teach, and my colleagues and students helped me to adapt to different local conditions. Whether the universities were in China, Malaya, Malaysia, Australia, Hong Kong, or Singapore, I saw no borders. That made it easier for me to make myself useful wherever I was. In short, I could go on with my work to connect the past with the present and look for links that would help me identify possibilities for the future. And I could do that best by exploring our region between islands and continents. And that exploration has guided my work and became the story of my life, the subject of this book. For getting so many of you to come to this launch, let me once again thank Tommy, Hong Kong Shipping, and World Scientific. And thank you all for coming.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's my great privilege and pleasure to be here today. Maybe I'd like to first give a quick homage to Prof. Wang. I had him on a podcast a while back. That video did quite well. It's about 100,000 plus views now. And I've had a lot of listeners actually email to me that it rekindled a sense of interest and wonder for history because they managed to hear from him. And then soon after, Pagita Wijawan from Indonesia, his team wrote into me and said, they were thinking of flying down to Singapore to actually interview Prof. Wang, and they did. And I sit in on the interview. And for 2.5 hours, I was enraptured by Prof. Wang. And I consider it a great act of service and love that you've continued to inspire many younger generations of Singaporeans here today. So, Prof. Wang, I'd like to first express my thanks to you. Prof, I wanted to start with a question that bothered me a little, mainly because I think it reflected my own incompetence. You wrote this line in your book and you said, amid the great turbulence, the historian in you could always see some semblance of structure. A lot of us, when we see chaos, we see disorder in the world today, we feel discombobulated, we feel a sense of confusion. How do you see a sense of order in chaotic times?
I have a very simple understanding of our human condition, that all of us seek order because we can't stand chaos. We can't stand the turbulence that we often meet. We can't stand it, so we all work for order. And I'm very impressed by the fact that people everywhere work so hard to achieve order throughout history. And yet, again and again, they have failed. And I've come to think that it's probably inevitable that we fail because of our own lack of capacity to understand ourselves. And that is why I think the past is so important. The past may not tell us everything, but being aware of the past, that there may be lessons to learn from the past, probably could help us at least make the turbulence and chaos of the future more acceptable and something you can live with, you can deal with. There are no simple answers to order because order has never been around for too long. Almost invariably, again and again, order fails because of the incapacities in the vast majority of people who can't quite cope and can't keep order and sustain order for long periods of time. The reasons are too complicated to go into here, but when you look at the spread of history, it's amazing how people can make success fail completely again and again. And all I can say is that being a natural optimist. All I can say is that, thank goodness, almost every time after the period of failure, people succeed again to re-establish a new kind of order, always hoping that that order will last longer, will be better. And that again is something that one can hope for, that we may well, in fact, one day be good enough, capable enough, and able to sustain that vision long enough to make that order last longer and longer in the future. But I'm not sure about that, because in my lifetime, I've learned that while things were much slower when I was young, it's become much faster today. And the speed at which things change now make it almost impossible for me even to keep up with what is happening every day. So I'm not sure that this very optimistic perspective that I had learned to acquire will be able to handle the speed at which things are changing. Because in the days when things are slower and people have more time to think and plan and adjust accordingly, yet they fail. So with the speed that we are going, how can we as human beings be able to build up that capacity to deal with that speed? That is a puzzle to me. I may be totally wrong. We may have reached a stage where that very speed, the new kinds of technology, can actually help us overcome the kind of stage of disorder that we are so regularly faced with. But I'm not sure. All I can say is that I hope we have learned, and I hope we will continue to learn from the past.
Looking back at your life, you've witnessed revolutions, you've witnessed the birth of new nations, the birth of new orders. I'd like to ask you to, give us an object lesson, perhaps, to really draw home the point about how to see order in a time of chaos. So maybe it might be useful for you to maybe look back in, say, for example, your time from a young historian till now. What was perhaps the most turbulent time that you have lived through? And how did you make sense of that period?
There are so many stories one can tell. But let me give you two quite obvious examples that you might find relevant here. You might find relevant here. One is the Treaty of Westphalia, that we say that from that onwards we began to have the idea of borders and attempt to bring about a new peace to avoid wars. And that came from 30 years of war in which millions were killed when people of the same religion killed each other mercilessly. But after 30 years of killing, they decided they really must get down and try and find a way to prevent future killing. And they did. They actually met and they had an agreement that there will be borders and people will respect those borders and not cross the borders to attack and intervene elsewhere. And it lasted for quite a long while. It was eventually led to the creation of new nations, the idea of a nation state, each again recognizing the sovereignty of a nation, recognizing its borders, recognizing that its people, all its people, as citizens of a nation, belong to the people and have all the rights of citizenry. A tremendous step forward. So there was one example where total misery after 30 years of killing, people conceived of a world that would end all killing, at least minimize the number of killings. And they succeeded for quite a long while. The second example is that nation-state idea with national empires that followed didn't work in the end. In the end, the national empires fought each other to a standstill with First World War, Second World War, and virtually destroyed themselves. And the whole of Western Europe was subject to absolute destruction, what was the worst of its kind. And at the end of it all, again, the human condition is remarkable. Again, with great optimism, they've reconstructed a new world of the new United Nations. And what wonderful set of principles were evolved then. As a young student, I was utterly amazed and full of admiration for the ideals that we were set out for the United Nations. A world of innumerable nations, all equal, all sovereign, and all independent. And the question of respecting borders was absolute in the idea of sovereignty. And that, of course, was raised great hopes. All of us, I think, shared in that hope that we will now face a world in which there will be peace. And I think the efforts were genuine, highly idealistic, and tremendous effort by all kinds of people to try and make it work. And it did work for a while, all kinds of problems, but despite the problems, despite the rivalries and ideological differences, and also some ambitions of people with desire to conquer the world or something like that, we still have a lot of problems. But in relative terms, for about 40 or 50 years, there was a kind of balance in which people respected enough of each other to prevent the worst of wars. And yet, when the Cold War that enabled that balance came to an end, when it looked as if one power or one superpower could now manage and enforce the rules of the United Nations and have a world in which there will be peace, instead of which it all went wrong. I cannot explain, I mean, too complicated to explain what went wrong. But when people had that power, and in fact was expected to use that power wisely, failed again. And when that happened, a series of events destroyed that illusion that one superpower can enforce the rules that make the United Nations really successful. Not just based on a balance of mutual destruction, but on genuine principles of the United Nations. But it failed. And what we've seen now for the last 40 years is a series of decline from those ideals and the faith and principles that people believed in, slowly declining and losing faith in the very things that created that hope and world that I described. So what went wrong? I cannot explain it simply. But certainly the lessons of the past is that we shouldn't be surprised. There is no such thing as a perfect order in which we will last forever. It fails again and again. But at the same time, at the back of it all, there's also that remaining fact of history, that after a period of failure, people learn enough from it to try and rebuild something that would be better. So I still have that hope, being a natural optimist, that there will be somebody somewhere, or some group of people somewhere, who will reconstruct a new vision of peace and reproduce a world which has learned the lessons from the past. I hope so anyway.
Thank you for sharing that. You know, I had a chance to speak with Prof. Tommy and Prof. Kishore, and I think you joined them in that leap of being both UN lovers and eternal optimists, in which that, you know, we see the failures, we see the tragedies, but nevertheless, we should remain eternal optimists and continue to chart along for the sake of progress. So with that, I would like to ask you a question about you as a historian. You wrote in your book this about you recounted your first article that was published in the Journal of Sinology, I think in 1957. And you made this comment, you said, you know, you understood how Thucydides and Herodotus would affect the way or impact the way history writing was done in the West. I think you kind of saw it as a throwaway line. To me, it was profound. I wanted to ask you to first help me understand what do you mean by that? How did these two figures, you know, impact the way history writing was done in the West? And then I would like to ask you, you know, how did China's own tradition affect their understanding of history? Where did these both schools of thought diverge?
You see, what I was really impressed by all these ancient historians who had spent so much time in thinking about their experiences and drawing from their experiences to see whether there were lessons for the future. I mean, Thucydides is a very good example. I mean, he drew it entirely from his own experiences, and he tried to sum it all up and provide some thoughts, some ideas for a better world. Herodotus was a bit wider. He had a much wider perspective of the world. But nevertheless, the same idea was there, that the collective experience of all the peoples that he could learn about, all the lessons that could be learned from these experiences, could lead us to a world which will be a better place. If we understand that world better, it will be a better place. All of them seem to embody to me the faith in the idea that you can learn from the past, and we should try to learn from the past. So historians were not people who were looking for the truth. What they were looking for were lessons to learn from the past. That's my take from even in the Greco-Roman tradition of history. And there were other traditions. But you also ask for Chinese history. That is even more obvious, because you look at how the Chinese wrote history. Of course, the greatest of them was Sima Qian, but before him there was Zuo Duan and all the others, early records. But the emphasis of his great work was really not about history as we understand it today, although we translate his Shiji as his histories. It is not, because the word Shi actually means records, documents. And what he really is saying is that we have now a collection of records and documents about the past. They have been preserved. We have to read through them, make sure that they are genuine, authentic, correct, and accurate, and pick from them those documents that will help us understand what lessons we can learn from the past. And he makes it pretty obvious. And his successor, Wang Gungwu, who wrote the Han Dynasty. And so between the two of them, Shiji and Han Shu, they set a pattern of a historical tradition which really says this is all what it's about. We learn from the past, we transmit it to the future so that you will not make the same mistakes. And these documents are there to prove what was right, what was done correctly, and what was done badly and caused the fall and decline and fall of a dynasty and so on. And bad rulers appeared. And so behind it all, there was a kind of moral. It's not an ordinary moral between humans. It was a moral of governance. That governance itself has a kind of moral lesson, because the governance itself is based on the idea that you govern because you care for the people. That is a mandate of heaven. Heaven chose you to be a leader because you are supposed to care for the people. And if you care for the people will live happily. There'll be social harmony, stability. That was the idea. And if that is the case, you continue peacefully and people are very happy and to continue living in that way. But because you fail, the rulers make mistakes, they are greedy, they are corrupt, the rulers are corrupt, the soldiers are ambitious and they try to take over, and so all kinds of ambitions begin to come in the way of that good governance. And before long, it starts to decline. People's private interests, private greed, and private ambitions come in the way, and it goes wrong. And they show how it went wrong. So after that, it became a tradition that every dynasty would learn from the previous dynasty by collecting the records and documents that have been preserved, selecting from them what would illustrate where that dynasty succeeded and did well, and where it did badly, and is the reason why they have fallen and are been overcome and taken over by another dynasty with a new mandate of heaven. And the mandate of heaven was determined by the fact that the people rebel against you and overthrow you and set up a new dynasty. That is the mandate of heaven. That tells you that you have failed and the people don't want you anymore. They want a new ruler. And then it starts all over again. But what happened is they learned that the way to do it is you take the documents from the previous dynasty, all the historians, we might call them historians, the document collectors, to sift through the documents, pick and choose the best documents to illustrate what went wrong and what didn't go, what caused their collapse and decline and collapse, and then put it down and transmit it to your present dynasty. that you learn from the mistakes of the previous dynasty. And you did that, every dynasty did that for the previous one. In fact, it became a new profession in a way of people to draw lessons from the past to teach the future. In the Tang Dynasty, they actually set up a history office to precisely to collect the documents, even as the dynasty is unfolding, to collect the documents that might produce evidence and to prove what is good governance and what works and what is bad and doesn't work. At least they try to do that. At the end of the dynasty, you collect it and you start again. Every dynasty did that all the way down to the 20th century. And in fact, even today, the Chinese are facing a problem of writing the history of the Qing dynasty, which hasn't been done because the modern historians of the Chinese Republic thought, we don't need to do that anymore. We're now modern historians, we learned from the West, we don't have to do that anymore. So they took modern history to start in 1840 with the Opium War. And as a result, the Qing history has no beginning or end because the modern history starts from 1840. Anything before 1840 is pre-modern, if not ancient history. In fact, they actually call it 古代史, ancient history. So that completely distorted the Chinese rhythm of history telling. But now what I find fascinating is that the present regime, after having two revolutions and trying so hard to learn from modern civilization that was developed in the West, they tried to learn it. They learned it from both sides. They learned it from the capitalist, liberal capitalists, and they learned it from the socialists of Western and Central Europe. And both those ideas actually come from the same Enlightenment period, which actually flows from the wisdom of the Treaty of Westphalia and the nation-state building that was brought this idea of citizenry, the rights of individuals, the rights of people, and so on. All these were debated. And as you know, the formula is a very old formula, liberty, equality, and fraternity. And in particular, the two words, liberty and equality. And what is so interesting was that from the very beginning, the people who founded the Enlightenment philosophies already distinguished between the two claims of liberty and equality, and that there was a tension between the two. And those who emphasized liberty at the expense of equality would face opposition from those who emphasized equality at the expense of liberty. And this became a big thing within Europe. This is not something between the United States and China or something invented today. It was there within the European tradition itself. And China was so keen to save its civilization, to learn from the West. They looked at both West and they realized, one group realized, if they chose one way, it would work. The other said, no, it's the other way that will work. But they were actually both learning from the West. And they learned so well from the West, they now are pretty nearly catching up in every respect. But what I find so interesting is that the more they learn from the West, they more also learn from their own history. What was the long thousands of years of history? What was that to them? Is it still meaningful, or do you just discard it altogether? On the contrary, they discovered that you cannot copy either of the West and still be Chinese. There's something else that Chinese wisdom or their past was teaching them. I cannot summarize it for them because that's how they see it. I don't agree with it necessarily, but all I say is I try to understand how they are doing it. And they are doing it by referring to their past for lessons of what not to do not to fail. They may not learn it, but this is what they are trying to do. And I find it interesting that if you look at Chinese historiographers today, they don't talk about Marxist history, which they had learned from the West, even though they're called the Communist Party of China. They don't use Marxist history model anymore. What they are doing is, in fact, to say, well, what went wrong with the Cultural Revolution? What went wrong with the Republic of China after 1911 that caused it to fail, and then we needed a second revolution? And what went wrong with the Qing dynasty? And the irony of it all is that if you look at all the very popular books and TV shows and films that are made in China today, they are great admirers of the 18th century, the century of great peace and stability and success of the Qing dynasty of three emperors, Emperor Kangxi, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, covering the whole century. The three emperors covered the whole of the 18th century. And they're not even Chinese. They were Manchus, conquerors of China. And yet it was during that 18th century that China became very prosperous, more prosperous than ever before, was very stable, no internal wars to speak of, determining their borders as during that century, and provided the Chinese people with the confidence that China has become great again. And yet it was at the peak of that, things began to go wrong. So again, there are lessons there. And when the British arrived in the 19th century, they found the Chinese totally incapable of dealing with relatively few foreign ships arriving at the coast of China, simply because they had neglected the sea and not bothered this. I won't go into the history of it, but what I want to emphasize is that they look back and say, yes, there was a great period long before they learned from the West. And before they learned from what was it there? So this led them back. And I'm very struck by the fact how many of the professional historians, as well as the policy makers and so on, how often they refer to Chinese history for examples of success and examples of failures. And the perfect example is corruption that Xi Jinping uses to try and control the country today. He uses that as a tremendously powerful weapon. He weaponizes the corruption issue in this country today. And then if you look up the whole of Chinese history, almost every dynasty, corruption was one of the major reasons why the dynasty begins to decline and fall. So even in the way he refers to corruption, the people, extraordinary ways, what is extraordinary is how the people respond to that. The people find that extremely easy to understand. We must cut out corruption, at least minimize it to an extent that could enable the country to survive and the country to prosper. And where are the examples? Every dynastic history that you read, the second half of it, of each dynasty, the major issue was that of corruption. I don't think that's an accident. There's something to it, that the system goes wrong when people become corrupt and people are and the leaders are incapable or not aware of it or not taking it seriously enough to try and stem it. And Xi Jinping, if I can say, he is also learning from history, not only from China's history, but other people's history. For example, I was very struck when he came to power. He said, the first thing he said, well, we must learn from the Soviet Union. Well, what did he mean by that? He said, why did the Communist Party of Soviet Union fail? And he said, if we had modeled ourselves on the Soviet Communist Party, and if they failed after 80 years or 90 years, what about us? Are we not in danger of that? And we had the same problems. They identified corruption as one of them. No, there were others, but he highlighted this one but it also fitted with his understanding of the whole of Chinese history. So it's coupling a kind of Marxist understanding of the corruption and destruction of the Soviet Communist Party to say, to save the Chinese Communist Party is to save China, and to save China, we must learn from all the mistakes, all the lessons we can learn from China's past. I see that as something very extraordinary, and I think it comes quite naturally to the Chinese. And therefore, I think this is their understanding of history, which is so different from us when we say history is the search of the truth. That is very respectfully correct. I totally agree with that. But the fact is that what do you learn from the past that will enable you to at least avoid some of the worst mistakes when you go forward to the future?
Thank you, Prof, for enlarging us. I've had like 15 questions here, all right? So I cut it down to 3, and I realized that I could be selfish and indulge in myself, but I thought it would be useful to just quickly open the floor up for questions.
Ambassador Chan asks, if corruption is constantly the lesson that is picked up from dynasty to dynasty, do Chinese rulers or Chinese historians have the idea that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely? Did they ever draw that lesson from all the lessons of history?
I think that's a very good question. I probably cannot prove that the Chinese understood the idea of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, but they acted as if that were true. I mean, I don't think they actually spelled it out as a formula that they would draw from one formula from history. Probably they were not sure that that was always the case, but I don't know. But I think they acted as if that was true because they recognized that the emperor had tremendous power. But what they did was, instead of what the West did was to have law, constitutional checks and balances and so on, as a way of ensuring that the rulers do not get too powerful and do not get absolute power. That is, the West did it that way. The Chinese, from the very beginning, discarded the idea of the rule of law in that sense, but they emphasized the rule of li, which is proper behavior, a kind of relationship between the tremendous respect for relationships between people, and out of that you develop a way of behavior that recognizes what is correct, what is moral, and what is good, and shows caring for the people. So if you're a good ruler, the Confucian idea actually draws from it. The good ruler is someone who obviously cares for the people and is able to prove again and again that he cares for the people, that whenever something goes wrong, there's tremendous response from the central government to show that they care for great famine or foreign invasion or all kinds of locusts destroying the crops or whatever it was. All that was recorded, and the history records that, records the moments when the emperors responded immediately, and the officials all did their duty to try and keep the damage, to minimize the damage and bring order, safety, security to the people. So all this is accepted, not by law again. You see, in a way, law simplifies it because you have it laid down. The Chinese rejected that, and they have good reason. I won't go into that here today, but they rejected quite definitely because there were groups of people who are the legalists who talked about the law, and they used very severe laws to try and deter people from doing wrong. But the Confucians denied that, rejected that on the grounds that if that happens, either you kill the wrong people or you have a lot of injustice, and there's no way you can guarantee that those laws can be properly carried out unless you have good people. So the morality of the people, the quality of the people, and their sense of good and right, good and wrong, and their ability to project the sense of caring and being concerned for the welfare of the people. If you fail to do that, law is meaningless. This is what Confucius wanted to emphasize. So in a way, they are responding to the fact that there is such a thing as the past does have something to tell, which in a way captures the idea of power, absolute power corrupt absolutely. To prevent it by modality, ethics of the ruler and his mandarins.
All right, Prof. Kishore.
Professor Kishore asks, I'd like to pose a puzzle about Southeast Asia. This is one of the most diverse regions in the world, religiously, culturally, linguistically. We have large Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, and other communities living side by side. And yet, paradoxically, Southeast Asia has been relatively peaceful compared to other regions that are arguably less diverse. In South Asia, for example, the differences between Pakistan and India, or even between Bangladesh and India, are not as vast as the diversity we see in Southeast Asia, and yet conflict has been frequent. In Europe, despite deep cultural familiarity between Russians and their European neighbours, we are witnessing one of the most brutal wars in recent history. So the real question we should try to answer is this: why has Southeast Asia, despite its immense diversity, avoided major wars among its member states, apart from isolated conflicts like Thailand and Cambodia? When you attend ASEAN meetings, there is a noticeable comfort level among leaders. They sit in the same room and talk to one another with a certain ease. Where does that comfort come from? What are the historical roots of this relative peace and mutual accommodation among Southeast Asian societies?
Well, that is a very big question. But let me put it this way, to try and sort of simplify for myself anyway. It may not satisfy everybody, but for myself, I was very struck by the fact that Southeast Asia was the furthest away from Eurasian continent. It was between two oceans. And the sea, long before we created all the wonderful ships that and they can traverse the ocean so easily today, the sea was a dangerous place. And people were much more concerned about their safety at sea, and no major navies were ever developed in the two oceans between Indian and Pacific Oceans. So I like to, at least this is my starting point, that the Southeast Asia was the furthest away from the Eurasian continent. And the Eurasian continent was where the major struggles on land, fighting over territory, the mobility of people on horseback, the ability of people of those people with their modern versions of a tank to cross the continents at great speed. And if you have a superiority of good horses, you could actually dominate the world. And it happened again and again. And the civilizations that were all confronted by this all had tremendous difficulties. So even when you look at India when it was the South India, where it was entirely between two oceans, was relatively peaceful. I mean, if you go back to the Mauryas and so on. But what really went wrong was really over the northwestern frontier. Again, from Central Asia. Where did all the enemies of India come from? From Central Asia. Where did all the enemies of China come from? From Central Asia. Where did European enemies come from? They would also say from Asia. The Indo-Europeans who went to take over Europe all came out of Eurasia. I mean, even the Indo-European. Why do they call it Indo-European? It's Indo because they linked it up with India and Europe. It was Central Asia that they moved west instead of moving east and moving south. They were too cold to move north. They moved in all the other three directions. But Southeast Asia was beyond them because this is ocean. So I think Southeast Asia, from that point of view, was very lucky. It was like that. And the thing is that when they did come across new ideas, they accepted it because it was nothing forced on them. They could pick and choose what they wanted. And so when they learned about what the Indic civilization, what the Indians had to offer, at a time when India was extremely peaceful, and it's not the time of when the Turco-Mongols attacked India and the Islamic states from Persia and so on attacked India, or even Alexander, you go far back enough, all came in from the Central Asian side, the northwest frontier. When the ocean was left to the Indians and the people in Southeast Asia, they learned from one another without any problem. New ideas from India was accepted in Southeast Asia and taken almost everywhere. For 1,000 years, Indian civilization really permeated all over Southeast Asia because it was peaceful. It was something that you can pick and choose and select. Nobody was forced it on you, but never by force. And the thing was that in the case of China, Chinese civilization was up in the north, threatened all the time by northern invaders. They never bothered about the south. They, in fact, once they reached the south with the coast, they stopped. They didn't actually want to go beyond that because that was enough. Their problems are really up in the north. And in fact, one of their successes was they learned how to handle the northern invaders very successfully over so many dynasties. But in the end, that was their weakness because they never anticipated that they could be attacked by sea from the south. So that was their final mistake. But the thing is that they were right for thousands of years to deal with the north. So they never bothered with Southeast Asia. What the Chinese offered Southeast Asia was not like the Indians at all. What they offered was trade, technology, economic benefits, and so on, right from the beginning. In fact, people have asked me this question: did Chinese civilization influence Southeast Asia? what is so interesting was that Chinese civilization was so compact in its kind of way, was defined by this very highly moralistic, based on a very complex linguistic system, language, which meant it was very difficult to learn from Chinese civilization. And the Chinese civilization had no missionaries. They didn't set out to tell anybody about their civilization. People either adopted it or not. And by the time the Chinese civilization reached the coast of Southeast Asia had already been highly Indianized all the way to Vietnam. So it was already there, and they didn't need anything from China. But what they needed from China was what China was able to give them was things like trade, economic relationships, and specific technologies which the Chinese had, which were new to Southeast Asia. And that was a very happy relationship. The Chinese remained very much involved in Southeast Asia through trade. The Indians started with trade, but also penetrated a lot of aesthetic, musical, artistic, philosophical, and moral values and brought to Southeast Asia. So that part of it, as I said, I'm oversimplifying. The distance from Eurasia was what made Southeast Asia a special place. And even today, we are faced with the same problem. When people talk about, oh, it's no longer North Atlantic, it's now Indo-Pacific. Now, what does that tell me? As if it was some new invention, something new. On the contrary, Indo-Pacific is the most ancient set of relationship between those two oceans. And the people who benefited were people in Southeast Asia, in between those two oceans. And now we're back to Indo-Pacific. Now, if Indo-Pacific means anything, and it has a future, Southeast Asia has a good future.
What do you think your unique contributions as a historian is?
When Tommy mentioned I hesitate to call myself a historian because I don't do history the way professional historians do history today, because they are guided by a scientific goal, which I respect, the search for truth, and I totally respect that. Except that my understanding of the past is that the past keeps on changing. Every time you find a new document, you have to rewrite the history. So history doesn't seem to be fixed for a very long time. You're constantly rewriting history, whether you like it or not. It doesn't stay still. If that is the case, then the professional historians are well positioned. They have a lot to do. They will always have work to do because you will always find something new and you have to rewrite history again. I've seen people rewrite history in the last few decades so often. People have been rewriting their histories, including Singapore, that I think that we have to be very careful what we mean by this is the truth, this is history, this is true. So in that sense, I'm not a historian. I'm not out to find out the truth because I know that truth will always evade me. I will never be able to pin it down because who knows that by the next day some new document will appear from somewhere and then show that that's not how it happened. It was quite different. And then I asked myself, is that what's so important? Does that really matter? For those who search for the truth, the scientific method is totally respectable, and as I said, I respect that. But for myself, it doesn't help me understand the past if you keep changing it all the time. What is more important is that I'm aware that it can change all the time, that I look out for and be sure that in my mind that this is not fixed, but for the time being, this is how we understand it. And if we understand it that way, does it tell us anything? Does it teach us anything? How does it help us in dealing with the present and the future? So that is what has begun to interest me. So I don't know whether it sets me apart from others. I think lots of other historians, whether they'll realize it or not, are doing that anyway. And there are lots of people who don't just search for the truth, but are using the past to try and understand it. But of course, you can also abuse the past, to pick from the past what you want to use to influence people to do the things you want them to do. So that's another way. You're abusing the past. I hope I don't do that. All I really want to do is to find out whether there are lessons for us. What are the lessons that are worth learning? And what are the lessons that can be learned from what we know? And if we don't know it, don't pretend that you know. Try and find out try and see whether there are connections and links between the past of one part of the world and another. And I'm constantly surprised that human beings in different parts of the world very often behave in very similar manners. They may not recognize it because there are all sorts of cultural descriptions and so on, and ideological aspects can keep them separate. But in fact, if you actually look at how human beings actually behave when they're ambitious or they're greedy or they're cruel and so on, they do very similar things. And the reason why they do it, if you go far enough and see what actually happened, they're very similar. They're not all that different either. So when you look at it that way, it seems to me it gives us a better way of understanding what we are like as human beings. So I don't think I'm different to other people, but I have been consistently concerned not to let just the search for the truth be the only history, but the history will also be understood and used as best as we can to help us understand the future and the possibilities of the future.
Okay, suddenly we have 3 hands. So maybe we can quickly, for the 3 of you, we have the mic runner, just run through all 3 and then we'll group the 3 questions together.
A member of the audience asks, how should we understand the importance of the Tang and Song dynasties?
If you're referring to the Tang-Song period, actually you've got a finger on one of the most crucial periods of change in Chinese history. There are people who say that Chinese history never changed. Every dynasty looks alike. They just keep on repeating it. So it is not true. But in particular, that Tang-Song transition is very, very crucial to Chinese history. And there are many reasons, but let me just concentrate on two points. One was that the Tang dynasty was a very rich dynasty, combining the cultural and civilizational differences that they drew together from all over the world that was open to them through the 7th and 8th century. As you know, Xi'an, the capital of Tang dynasty, was open to the whole of the Eurasian continent, and cultural influences came from every direction, arrived in China, and it made that dynasty into an extremely open and rich one. But of course, it collapsed. One rebellion, the Anglo-San rebellion from Central Asia, the dynasty collapsed, and after that it would decline very rapidly into a period of warlords all the way down to the 5 dynasty, which I studied. And then the Song dynasty was an attempt to end that period of warlords and reunite China. And to put it very simply, that the second part of the story was, it succeeded. But the extraordinary thing was that to succeed, it became militarily very weak. For reasons, again, too complex to get into now, they never really reunited the whole of China. They failed to reunite crucial parts of North China, and the North China was controlled by the Khitans for 100-odd years, followed by the Georgians, who controlled even larger parts of North China for the next 100-odd years, and finally by the Mongols, who eventually conquered the whole of China. Now, during those 300 years, what was happening was had a paradox. On the one hand, the Chinese, as a military force, was weaker and weaker. From northern Tang-Song dynasties, which at least controlled about 2/3 of the original Tang dynasty China, they shrank to something like 1/5 of the original China. They shrank, and we call it the northern Song and the southern Song. But by the southern Song, theoretically, that was the only China left, because the Khitans were not Chinese, the Georgians were not Chinese, and certainly the Mongols weren't. So the Chinese only remained in 1/5 of the original Tang Empire. And yet that transition, the paradox was, that transition was the Chinese economy really flourished. The technology, the kind of inventive, creative work in agriculture and in every kind of technology you can imagine, flourished tremendously. And the wisdom of the scholars also flourished. Ironically, it had something to do with the invention of printing. And the fact was that when the classics were printed, instead of having to be copied by hand, which you met, very few people read the classics in the original. Once it was printed, it was available for anybody who was literate to read the classics for themselves, and that encouraged greater literacy. And more literate people read the classic, the more they had contributed to reinterpreting the classics. And it was during that time that the whole of Chinese corpus of Chinese learning was brought together by a whole group of larger and larger group of very bright young people who then drew upon the best work from Confucianism, legalism, Taoism, Buddhism to reinterpret the classics for their purpose, for their use. And they succeeded. And we talk about Neo-Confucianism today. Neo-Confucianism became a great set of philosophical classics during the Song dynasty. In the southern Song dynasty, not the north, started in the north, but the southern Song dynasty became perfect. The man who became the symbol of Neo-Confucianism was Zhu Xi, who was actually living in the southern Song. And that was Confucianism at its best. And the irony of it all was that in military terms, it was not possible for Southern Song to have reunited China at all. We know, everything we know about the Southern Song was it was lucky to survive militarily. They fought desperately. They produced a lot of heroes like Yue Fei and so on, all about tremendous patriotism and fighting the Joseon. But they were never capable of reuniting China. And who reunited China? The Mongols did. Who were a bunch of completely non-Chinese, who in fact, when the Mongols conquered China, they were the least Sinicized of all the confederation of tribes that were enemies of the Chinese. And yet they conquered China, and long history, I won't go into that. And only the Mongols, by having conquered China, ironically, when the Mongols are driven out, the Chinese were able to, as it were, inherit the Mongol Empire that had been reunited for them and became the Ming Dynasty. But this is the irony of it all. The Song Dynasty had produced tremendous economic prosperity for the Song, tremendous wisdom in Neo-Confucianism, and the Ming Dynasty, after the Mongols, inherited all that and then used the Neo-Confucianism as the basis for all examinations thereafter. So that the whole literati elite class passed examinations based on how they knew that set of Confucian classical interpretations by the Neo-Confucians that were finalized in the 12th and 13th century, or 12th century particularly, of the Southern Song. And that narrowed the vision of the Chinese. The whole Mandarinate was educated to pass those examinations based on one set of classics, or at least the classics they were agreed on. Basically, 四书五经, the four classics and the five great, again, of multiple classics. But they were, you master them, you pass the great imperial exam, you become high officials, and a whole literati class was created who became very uncreative. Because that was what they based their power and influence on the ability to understand and repeat what the classics taught. The better they understood the classics as it was taught, the higher the jobs they would get. And the Ming Dynasty collapsed after that. The Manchus came in from outside. The Manchus are very clever because the Manchus knew they were just 1 million or so of them, not very large. They conquered a country of something like 150 million to 200 million, 150 million at least. They conquered them, and what they did was they used the Ming system, used the Chinese literati to control the Chinese. They just provide the military leadership on top and use the literati to rule the Chinese as the Ming Dynasty ruled the Chinese. And kept the examination system exactly as it was. You're passing exams through learning that same set of Confucian classics all the way. efforts to improve them were made, but not succeeded. The tradition was you must pass those classics and be as true to those classics as possible if you wanted to succeed as a Mandarin. And that ultimately was what completely destroyed Chinese civilization as was known at the time. I'm oversimplifying. So what is great success, paradox, and the Tang-Song transition was so great, it created this literati class who were so well educated. They were so well educated in narrow and narrow terms. They're not open to new ideas. They just thought that those classics comprised all the wisdom that was necessary for ruling China. And that was an absolute disaster for Chinese civilization.
Well, so the lesson I learned was that standardized exams are a way to kill creativity and destroy a civilization. I guess that's the right lesson. Perhaps we have one last question. Prof. Wee, will give it to you. You're the honor of asking the last question.
Professor Wee from the Penang Institute asks, "We know that geography plays a crucial role in shaping history and politics. At the same time, we have to be careful not to overstate its influence or fall into geographic determinism. How should we think about the proper weight to give geography in our understanding of historical and political developments?"
The question is, to what extent should we ascribe the importance of geography?
I actually agree. I don't want to sound geographically deterministic on this at all. But I only bring it up because I think it also cannot be ignored. And geography is a vital part of our historical understanding. Because whenever we talk about history, is not only about time. History is also about space. What space you occupy, how you use that space, what you make use of, how you make use of that space to gain whatever you want, power and wealth. And you make use of that space and how you do that. So it's not just a geography, it's how the agency of the human groups involved can make use or take advantage of whatever geographical advantages that they find or they can make of the geographical features that they find to make use of them to maximize their strength. A good example, I would say, I mentioned the others, but I hadn't mentioned it enough, of the Mediterranean. Now you can say the Mediterranean has got nothing to do with the Eurasian core or the Eurasian sentiment. It's just a small sea that was completely surrounded with two little bits. The Straits of Gibraltar, a little bit in the Black Sea, and not even into the Red Sea. That was how limited it was. So it's very limited. So you can say that the geography actually would have limited the people there to a small part to play in history. And yet, that's the very opposite happened. Because of the intensity of the relationship in that small sea, all the people involved were so connected with each other. They had to fight each other all the time because they were so close, so proximate. Unlike Southeast Asia, very dispersed and widely dispersed. And the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean are tremendous oceans. To the people on one side of the Indian Ocean and the other part of the Indian Ocean can hardly deal with one another. And to use those ships to do anything very serious took a long, long time before they could develop it. Whereas in the Mediterranean, right from the beginning, you find it from the days of the Cretan Empire, from the Egyptians and all the various civilizations of the Tigris-Euphrates area that were participating in the Mediterranean. The Persian Empire against the Greeks, the most famous of which, the Persians against the Greeks. It's probably no accident. We still talk about Iran today as a major trouble to the world. But Persians were already active and the Greeks were fighting them. And you can argue it on ideological grounds. The Greeks were representing city-state democracy, and the Persians are a bunch of authoritarian rulers who are very cruel and dastardly and so on. And yet, that war between the Greeks and the Persians, in a way, was the best example of what the Mediterranean was doing to all the people. The Greek colonies are everywhere. The Romans are based on it. All the various tribes in North Africa that were more and more intensely connected with one another, having to survive under those conditions. And they created a very distinct civilization as a result of that. It was civilization of not only exchange of trade and military skills, but exchange of philosophies, of religion, visions of the future. Great philosophers and religious leaders were came out of it. In the course of fighting with each other, they were improving themselves all the time. And yet, out of that, you wouldn't believe that that could make a difference to the rest of the world, but it did. Because in the end, that intensity made it impossible for them to depend on the Mediterranean alone. They had to get a way out. And the fact was, the Mediterranean could not reach the Indian Ocean by themselves because they were blocked up by Islam. The conquest of the North African coast by Islamic forces in the 7th century tremendously transformed the Mediterranean civilization into one between two forces, the Christians and the Muslims. And the Crusades of that era, the intensity of those crusading wars of nearly 1,000 years was really immense. It's a fascinating history and tremendously beautiful stories come out of it. But the net result was the Mediterranean was completely cut off from the trade of India and China. The two wealthiest part of the world was not accessible to the people of the Mediterranean who were not Muslims. And that intensified the kind of crusading wars between Islam and Christianity. So what happened was they were forced to look to the Atlantic, something they never dared to do because they thought that would be the edge of the world. And the world was flat, and you go too far, you drop off the other end. So the idea that the earth was round had to come first. And that took a long time. It's quite extraordinary how long it took before the people finally thought, maybe the world is round. And if you go the other way, you can get to India. And that's what they set out to do. They were setting out to India. Nobody knew about the Americas. They were setting out to India. But the point is that they set out that way, whereas the Portuguese set out the other way, came down Africa, and went down the Cape of Good Hope. Why did they do that? They did that because they couldn't get to India or China any other way, completely blocked. They had a moment of the Pax Mongolica when they could do that. And where Marco Polo told beautiful stories and inspired the Europeans to even more wanted to go to China and India, but even more frustrated by the Muslims who blocked them. So they went round. So then, of course, they brought a new kind of war into Southeast Asia. And the thing was, what made the difference was what they perfected in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, a narrow Mediterranean with small ships, they learned how to fire cannons without the ship sinking. For some reason, all the navies or ships of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea never did that. They never knew how to fire a cannon on a ship without the ship sinking. So it was the Mediterranean people who perfected that. And those Portuguese became great cannon builders. And this is what actually was the whole story of the Portuguese victories in Asia. The first 100 years was all about Portuguese cannons. And they made the whole difference to the war in the Indian Ocean. And so the Indian Ocean became different. Same with the Pacific. The Spanish came across once they got to Mexico, to Acapulco, or they came around the Cape of Storms into the Pacific. Once they go to the Philippines, they come the other way. So it became global. But each of them, whether it's Portuguese or Spanish, they brought with them galleons which could fire cannons from this without sinking. And none of the Asian navies could cope with that. In fact, but one of the things that fascinated about this history was the way the Portuguese became mercenaries working for different kingdoms in Southeast Asia and Asia to build cannons, to become the experts on cannon building. See, technology again. Once the technology changes, then everybody started to do it. But none of them could beat the Portuguese for a long time. It was later the Dutch and English that provide superior naval power and put the Portuguese down. So the Portuguese themselves were never beaten by any Asian navy. So that took a long time, 100, 200 years, and then the English and Chinese and the English and the Dutch came, and they created something else, something that really was new. And this had nothing to do with cannons, it's to do with capitalism. It was doing commercial empires. The idea that you build an empire based on trade alone. But you need ports, you need control, you need monopolies, you need to dominate the trade, then you have absolute control, then you win. But it meant fighting everybody. But you fight for control of the ports. And from that, we have the whole story of the dominance of the West thereafter. And Asia, none of the Asian countries were able to build the kind of navies that could deal with the navies that developed after the English, the Dutch, the English, the French, to go all together in the Indian Ocean. And by the 18th century, the British Navy was the strongest in the world, and nobody could fight them to succeed for another 150 years or so.
Wow. So from China to the Mediterranean, from printing in China to the cannon building in Southeast Asia, it's no wonder the book is entitled No Borders. Once again, thank you everyone for coming. Maybe we give a round of applause to Pong Bagago. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you are watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications for whenever new episodes are out. If you're on Spotify or Apple, it would help us greatly if you could leave a 5-star review on those platforms. Once again, thank you for tuning in to the Front Row Podcast.